Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I see we're going to give just about 30 seconds more, see who else we have coming in. Good morning, Melissa. Just a reminder, I'm going to put in the chat that if you are interested in receiving CEUs, follow the instructions or read the blurb in the chat box. I'm about to put that there for everyone, and I'll copy that again at the end of the session. So I hope everyone's been enjoying this year's online conference. I know I have been. Today you have a presentation from Dr. Fazio Griffith and Dr. Williams on healing through expression, the use of creative interventions for emerging adults experiencing grief and loss. Again, if you would please save your questions until the end of the session, you can put those in the chat box and we will help the presenters make sure they see those, time permitting. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Dr. Fazio Griffith, I believe is beginning things.
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'm so excited to see so many people interested in working with emerging adults experiencing grief and loss. I'm Dr. Laura Fazio Griffith. I'm a licensed professional counselor, supervisor. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm a registered play therapist supervisor. And I am an associate professor at Southeastern Louisiana University, where I coordinate our marriage and family program, and I coordinate our play therapy curriculum as well. So a lot of what you're going to hear today are creative interventions that come from my experience working with adults, who have experienced some grief and loss using those play creative techniques. So I'm going to let my co-presenter introduce herself, and then we'll get rolling.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is June Williams, and I am a colleague of Laura's at Southeastern in Hammond. And I am also an associate professor and the coordinator of the program. And for this presentation, Laura and I are kind of merging our respective areas of interest with grief and loss is my area that I tend to do a lot of presenting and research in, and also Laura's area is more of the play therapy, expressive arts, and I think a little bit of each of our interests has bled over to the other, because I have found that I've been incorporating a lot of the play activities, and a lot of the students that I supervise are also incorporating those as well. So I am going to go ahead and get us started. And also, for those of you who want the presentation, I will be probably uploading that in the chat, the link, so that you could have access to that after I get done with my part. So stay tuned for that in the chat. So we first want to start off by giving you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. And the first thing, I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of emerging adulthood, not going to dive too deep, but just a little bit of a background on that, and also to talk about some of the specifics regarding grief and loss and some of the things that you might see in this particular population. And then we'll go into talking about a rationale for why creative interventions with emerging adults is effective in working with areas of grief and loss. And Laura's going to give you a lot of interventions. And so hopefully at the end, you'll be able to design your own toolbox for using interventions, art, play, different techniques with emerging adults. And the neat thing about a lot of these things is that they're adaptable. We're going to give you the framework, but you can adapt these and use different prompts, different things that that you want to use with the populations that you're working with. So next slide. Okay, so a little bit of a background. Of course, we're all familiar with Erik Erikson, and he talked about when he developed the stages, and especially later on, that he was recognizing that there was a period of prolonged adolescence, that it wasn't this rigid age group that he, it's like the teen years we kind of think about for adolescence. But it was Arnett who actually first coined that term of emerging adulthood. And that was back around 2000. And so it's interesting because I did all of my graduate study before that, and I also now teach human growth and development. And so I had to go back and do some studying up because that was not something that I had learned in my own study. And for many of us that graduated before then, that was something that we had not learned about. And so when we talk about emerging adulthood, what we're talking about is that period roughly from 18 to 29. So it spans most of the 20s, typically what we think of as late adolescence, and then the 20s. But most of the time when we focus on that age range, we're looking at around 18 to 25. And some of this is taken from Arnett did a TED talk in, I think it was 2015. And so some of these talking points are actually from his TED talk. And so if you want to go back and listen to that, you could really just Google that, and I think it's about 10 minutes long, and you could look at that. But what he talked about is that, what got him thinking about developing the emerging adulthood is that he saw that there were 4 different revolutions that sort of shifted the way that people were developing. And the first part is what he called the technology revolution. And so what he talks about there is a shift from more of a manufacturing economy to a knowledge-based economy. And that's when we started getting more automation in technology, where people were being actually displaced in jobs. And so some of the people that went to work in plants and factories and things like that some of that was being done by machines. So there was an added level of training that needed to be done for these people. And so that was the shift to what he called the knowledge-based economy. And so that required more people to go to college, more people to go to pursue higher education longer. And even for those people that didn't go to college, there was a longer period of apprenticeships and learning. And so it wasn't like you get out, you get a job and you're established, as it was maybe for our parents, but people had longer in the job development part. The second thing that he talked about was what he called the sexual revolution, which was, more in the 1960s, which was, the early 1960s was when the birth control pill first came about. And so this, kind of changed perspectives on sexual activity, whereas before, sort of the mores around, marriage, procreation, family were somewhat different. There was a little bit more freedom in terms of being able to have sex, people having sex earlier, that sort of thing. And so there's a longer period of time where people are in and out of romantic or sexual relationships before they actually settle down with one partner, if they do settle down with one partner. And that's some of the changes now that maybe we're seeing that are different from maybe what Arnett saw. The next thing that he talked about was the women's movement, also in the 1960s, which, at that time in the early 1960s, there weren't a lot of people that went to college. And there were probably about 2 times as many more men, whereas now that's shifted to where there's slightly more women who are going to college than there are men, and who are going for longer times. And also, again, even for people who don't go to college, there's a lot more equity in jobs where there are women doing jobs that, say, in our parents' time were more jobs that only men did. So there were some shifts there. And then the last part was what he called the youth movement. And that was where, people really began to see this period as a time of, a positive time of prolonging their youth and enjoying that time. And he came up with the saying that, 30 is the new 20, which is the little meme that I have on there, because many of the milestones are occurring a little bit later. So Laura, you can go to the next one. And, this is beyond the scope of our presentation this morning, because we were a little bit more interested in some of the interventions, but I do want to point to that there are some criticisms of Arnett's theory. And even though he said in his research that he didn't just focus on, white, privileged, upper class individuals, that was the majority of the people in his study. Although if you look at the demographics at the time, it was pretty much in line with what the demographics were in the United States around that time. But I do want to point this out because I don't think we can just take some of the things that we talk about with emerging adulthood and apply those rigidly to everybody that's within that time frame, because it doesn't necessarily work, as with anything, right? And so it is more common, and this is more obviously his part about the technological revolution, is that this is his emerging adulthood fits more with industrialized societies and Western cultures. So some of the cultures that are not, Western, not as industrialized, don't necessarily fit this as well as some of the others. And there are some criticisms, and actually that's one that I have a little bit as well, is that some people claim that emerging adulthood and some of the characteristics that I'll talk about in a minute are actually more related to people of upper middle class and people of privilege. Things like people taking a gap year and things like that. Not everybody has the resources to do that sort of thing. So we have to take that into consideration when we talk about this. And another criticism is that some of the features are more related to some of the trends and society events rather than more inherent characteristics and development of the person. And that'll be interesting to see, given a lot of the things that's happened in our country in particular over the last 3 to 5 years, in terms of COVID, social political unrest, a lot of the racial injustices that we've seen. And so many of those things I think are going to talk about that. But yet, there are a lot of those characteristics that we see that are, fit everyone, regardless of country, regardless of status. And so it's just, think about the individual person that you're working with and their culture and their context as you're working with them. Okay, next. And so real quickly, just to talk about the features, and this is in terms of some of the developmental tasks that we typically talk about. Obviously it's, we talk a lot about adolescence as being that time of identity exploration. That's continued into emerging adulthood. And so that's something that people continue to grapple with. Obviously, we continue to grapple with it forever, probably, but it's a period of intense focus during that time. And there's also a good bit of instability and uncertainty during that time. It's kind of like what is and what isn't, kind of that being in between that he talks about there. And also more of a focus on oneself than a focus, more of a self focus than other focus, sort of beginning to move out of that egocentricity of adolescence, but that takes a little bit longer. And also it's a period, according to Arnett, a period of optimism. And that is a criticism that some people have, that he focuses a little bit too much on the optimism, but he sees it as a real positive time, and that exploration as being a time of discovery and exploration. Okay, next. And so this is very, very brief to think about some of the losses during emerging adulthood. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but what I did was put together, I kind of divided this into two different categories, because I think sometimes when we think about grief, we think about only losses related to death. And so I wanted to divide this up and talk about, yes, there's losses that are related to death, but there's also what we call living losses that people experience. And so some of the common death-related losses that we see around that time, a lot of people at this age and emerging adulthood are losing grandparents. And actually, in my own experience, even great grandparents, as some of the older adults in my family have been living longer. And so losing older family relatives, extended family members, is often that first experience of death for many emerging adults. And then for some, it's an off time loss to lose parents during this time, but it's not uncommon due to illness, injury, that sort of thing. And so you will see this. There's also the loss of friends, be that through accidents. This is a time period when suicide rates are fairly high. So experiencing that, depending on where someone's lives and their experience, sometimes they may be in an area where there is a significantly high number of homicides. And one that I added, and actually this was added after working with some of my supervisees who work with this age population, is that many of them have lost former classmates that maybe they're not in touch with anymore, but because of Facebook and social media, there's still that kind of loose connection, and they're very affected by that. And that's something that I added just, for consideration. And when we think, again, that's not an exhaustive list, but in thinking about some of the living losses that people experience, those are things that cause losses that cause grief, but they aren't the same as a death-related loss. And one of the ones I think about is like illness or injury, and that could be to oneself or to a family member, right? So those may be losing the ability to do things that you could do previously, and that has a big impact. I put addiction down, and I probably should have just put problem use. Maybe it doesn't rise to the level of addiction or doesn't rise to the level of a diagnosis, but this is a period of time, as I talked about, of experimenting, exploration. And so we see a fair amount of drug and alcohol use during this time, and also, like video gaming, things like that. And so sometimes those are like when someone is overusing something and then they're not using that anymore, then there are some losses that go along with that. There's also the loss of hopes and dreams that come along. Sometimes people think their life is going to turn out a certain way, and it doesn't turn out the way that they thought. I think about one of the things that we see often is that a lot of times people who maybe are exceptional athletes in high school want to go on to college, and they think they're going to play in the pros, and that just doesn't materialize. But yet their whole identity was wrapped up in that. And so those are things that they might experience. Racial injustice, I mentioned that a little while ago, and there's a generational component to that actually, one experiences throughout their lives. There's also financial insecurities, what I call the shattering of the assumptive world, that going about like that expectation that everything's going to go, we're going to be safe. Everybody around me is going to be safe. The world is a peaceful place. And we know that not to be true. I just think about the last 2 weeks and the number of mass shootings that we've seen in that amount of time. That definitely shatters some of those assumptions that we have. Also think we're not sure how COVID is going to affect this generation moving forward. I think it's going to be interesting to see. I do think there's a lot of loss that was disenfranchised during that time. And so people were not, there were a lot of things that people could not grieve or felt like they couldn't grieve. And some of this I do believe is going to be popping up with people later in life. And I put disasters because I probably because it's almost the beginning of hurricane season and I live on the coast, and we've experienced several significant hurricanes down here. But there's you think about the immediate after effect, but I'm almost thinking about even beyond that, of some of the other changes as a result of that. So that the changes in landscape, the changes in people having to move or being displaced. So those are things that we think about. Okay, Laura. And these are some things that have been identified as these are typical with people who are emerging adults, but also specific to some of the grief and loss. Obviously, the stress that people feel, because we're not just grieving a loss, we're also going about our lives. So there's a lot of different things going on at once. Depression and anxiety, those of you that work with emerging adults know that the rates of depression and anxiety have skyrocketed among this population. And that's not just in the last few years. That's something that's been a trend for quite a while. Certainly adjustment issues. You have people moving away from home, starting new jobs, some people starting families, experimenting with relationships. And so all of these are a time of adjustment that people are experiencing. Again, identity issues, I mentioned that, navigating relationships, and it's different. It begins to look different. Who I was in high school, who I am now, it's different. I'm getting more in touch with who I am, what's important to me. And I'm realizing that maybe some of the people that I thought were my friends maybe weren't. And so there's a lot that goes into that, navigating the relationship. And that comes out of that self-awareness. One of the things that I work a lot with my supervisees who work with this population is that that self-awareness of their emotions is something that they're just now beginning to get in touch with in emerging adulthood. There's a little bit of that probably that happens with adolescence, but I'm not sure our society still values this very much. And I also will throw in, regarding grief and loss, is that we still have in society in general a lot of myths and misconceptions about grief and loss, and some very sort of arbitrary timelines. And this is imposed on people who are growing up. And so what I find with people who come in around, the emerging adulthood period, a lot of times we look at maybe, yes, they had a precipitating loss that brings them into our office, but we don't want to just assume that that loss is the only thing that they're dealing with, because many of them have a lot of unresolved losses that they're dealing with that they didn't really look at earlier. And so it's sort of like, taking the bottle off, the top off of the bottle. So that's something to think about, that you're not just necessarily talking about one loss, even though that may be the presenting issue. And, again, with the self-awareness, is that people are beginning to get a little bit more in touch with what their values are, what their beliefs are. And specific to grief and loss, it's like, what's important to them? How do they grieve, as opposed to how they think other people think they should grieve? Okay, next. And so moving into the expressive arts, a lot of times when we think of play and expressive arts, we think of children. And yes, that is a population to use them with, but these can be particularly effective for emerging adults. And anyone who experiences a significant grief or loss is some are going to experience some trauma, but they're physical disruptions. So a lack of sleep, some depression symptoms, maybe not clinical depression, but some of the signs of depression that you might see. Some may have PTSD, there might be some burnout. You may be seeing substance use, which is often a distractor or, a way to self-medicate. And there may be also some suicide ideation. And so what we're looking at is to try to promote their self-confidence and help them to find ways to share their experience in a way that, sort of fosters their resiliency, their post-traumatic growth, if you will, that's going to get them more in touch with their identity and their sense of worth and their meaning. And, you know, when we look at it, the expressive arts, it's more of an individualized, client-centered, holistic approach, as opposed to a more narrow, rigid approach in working with them. But it also can lead to connecting them with others, and also reconnecting with themselves and feeling more empowered. Next. And so some other things that it does is that, you know, there's something about creating those visuals that can help people to verbalize. A lot of my students use Sandtray, and Laura's going to talk about that a little bit later. But, you know, it's sneaky in a way, if you will, that, you know, they're focused on this, and we're watching their processing, and they're verbalizing things that they're not even aware that they're processing at the moment. And it's up to us to help them realize and make those connections. And the other piece of the expressive arts is that it helps bring together, you know, the affective and the cognitive components. So it's like a form of integration. And also, you know, there's some healing when people can see and be validated when there's some connection. They know that they're not the only ones that are dealing with what it is that they're dealing with. Okay, next one. Okay, and I'm about ready to hand it off to Laura to do the next part. But, you know, the other things about the experiential therapies is that it's, you know, it is an emotional catharsis. It lets them verbalize, it lets them feel in the moment. And it also appeals to a wide range of, it's, you know, there are different senses that are involved, and even from an educational component, which we all know that counseling has an educational component to it always, is that the more senses that you can involve, the more powerful that learning experience is. And also there's a spiritual component, you know, this is that holistic component that we talk about. And I'm going to pass it off to Laura, and she is going to talk more about the interventions.
Yes, thank you, June. So I'm going to spend probably about the next 20-25 minutes talking about the specific interventions that you can use. And by no means is this an exhaustive list. What we've done in the presentation is just really highlighted some that we've used again and again, that we see our supervisees, you know, using, and that seem to be effective with emerging adults who have experienced some form of grief and loss. So we're going to talk a little bit about games, ritual and ceremonial goodbyes, sculpting, collaging, some bibliotherapy, eco mapping, music, mandalas, and the Sandtray. And again, this is not, you know, an exhaustive list. There are so many more out there. And this could be, you know, a presentation that could go on, you know, for hours and hours, because there's just so much. So I'm going to start with masking and sculpting, and just talking a little bit about the use of using clay and Play-Doh, you know, when you work with emerging adults. I find with emerging adults, clay tends to work better than Play-Doh. Sometimes, depending on the client, they find Play-Doh to be, you know, a little more kind of kiddish, but I give the client a choice, but usually it's more of more clay. And, you know, one of the things that it does when you use clay or Play-Doh, it really helps relieve stress, you know, for the client. It helps to focus their attention, you know, if they're having trouble focusing. It's really a great way for expressing anger regarding the loss that they've had. It also helps engage the imagination and storytelling. And with this particular activity, this masking activity, it does some of that. It engages them in like storytelling, it engages them in an actual activity. You can use it in both non-directive and directive ways. So this would be a directive prompt, you know, to give the client, but I think you can use it in a non-directive way. Sometimes I have had clients who want to just come in and talk, and while they're talking, they want to play, you know, with the clay, which is fine. And that would be a more non-directive way. And really, it's a great way to explore some emotional dynamics and that sense of loss that they're experiencing. So with this particular creative intervention, one of the things that you would do is you would give the client a prompt. And the whole focus of this is really talking with the emerging adult and identifying and exploring self, exploring some of those emotions behind the loss, looking at, is there a mask that I'm wearing because I've experienced this loss and I can't really show who I am to everybody, when I've experienced such a significant loss in my life. Or as, June was saying, we put these preconceived timelines on grief. So it's been a year. Why am I not moving on? Why am I not feeling better? Why am I still maybe stuck with all these feelings and emotions? So one of the things you would do is you would give the client the clay, and I would ask the client to create 2 masks for me. One would be the mask that they think that they project to the outside folks, in their life when they think about having experienced the loss, and what is that facade or persona that they seem to project out there. And then the other one is the mask that looks like who they really think they are. What are they feeling inside in terms of the loss? And then having the conversation with them about the differences with the mask and when is it appropriate to remove that persona of a mask and be the real mask, so to speak. And that really leads to a lot of really good discussion. It really helps them identify some of those emotions, some of those feelings around the loss, and really helps them explore self. If they're feeling confused at this point about who am I and what am I projecting. So it's a really good technique, to allow them to do that. And you can do it in a number of ways. You don't have to use clay or Play-Doh. I've used paper plates. I've used just drawing paper. So whatever tools that you have, you can create using this activity. All right, the next one I want to talk about is really is a good activity to do with a client who comes in who's experienced a loss in their life. And it really gets them to think about, what is my role, what is my belief, and what is my value system in terms of the loss that I've experienced. And again, when we think of loss, I think a lot of us, our brain just goes to death. And I think when we're working with emerging adults, or when we're working with any client, we really need to think out of the box. I think loss is, with this population, I see a lot of relationship loss, and just grieving the loss of a relationship that they thought was going to lead to maybe something serious and something permanent, and it doesn't. And that's a big loss for them. Also, I just wanted to mention pet loss. Some of the emerging adults, they've had pets that they've grown up with, and now they're at a point where they're, the pet is 15, 16 years old and they lose that pet. And that was their pet that they had when they were 7, 8, or 9. So that's a big loss for them as well. So I think really thinking out of the box when we think of loss. So this is a great creative intervention because it's very easy. All you need is index cards and markers. And what I would ask the client to do is, again, this is a directive activity. So I would give my client the prompt. We would take 10 index cards and I let them choose 10 markers, whatever markers they want to pick, 10 different colors. And I provide the following prompt. I would say, please think about the roles that you play in life before the loss and after the loss. So 5 index cards are delegated to before the loss and 5 are after the loss. And then, so they write 5 before the loss and 5 after the loss, and we have them in separate piles. And then I ask them, decide which of the 5 roles you would throw away before the loss. And we go through that process. And then 4, 3, 2, 1, and they're left with 1 remaining role. And then we go to the pile after the loss and we do the same thing. Which of the 5 roles would you throw away? Then we get down to 4, 3, 2, 1, and they're left with 2 roles in their life. 1 before the loss and 1 after the loss. And we talk about that. We talk about, what role did you choose? How hard was it for you to get rid of those other roles? How do you feel that you were able to throw those other roles away? Now, what is it like for you just to have these two roles, one that you had before the loss and one that you had after the loss? Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're different, but really being able to process that with the client in terms of what their life looks like now and what their life looked like before the loss. And how does that come together? How can we marry those two things, for them? It's a great visual, and it really helps them process, who was I before the loss? What roles did I fulfill? And who am I now? How has my life changed? And what am I going to do to make sure that, I can be congruent with that change? So this is something, that you could do over 2 sessions with a client, if you wanted to, or you could do it over 1 session, but it's just a great way for them to start to wrap their brain around what is life going to look like going forward, and what roles do I prioritize? Because sometimes I think when there's a loss, emerging adults tend to be pulled in different directions, and their life there changes, and they have a hard time wrapping their brain around that. So this is a really good visual for them to be able to do that. All right, so I want to talk for a few minutes about collages. This is actually one of my favorites. I think collages are a great way to help emerging adults think about the loss, maybe in totality, and to be able to have a great visual that you can use throughout your time with them. So you can do this maybe toward the beginning of your time with them, you can do it in the middle, you can do it toward the end. It's just a great way to show, their growth in therapy and their growth in terms of how they maybe conceptualize the loss, and how they're maybe using what you're doing with them during the therapeutic process to help them with that loss. So when you think about collages, I think we can use materials, magazines, you can use old picture books, you can use newspapers, you can do it, I call it the old-fashioned way, before all the clip art and all the pictures on computers. But you get paper, scissors, glue. I used to get, poster board, and you would just bring that in session, and you would allow your client to be creative with some of that, words, pictures, whatever, they wanted to do to cut out. And then, or the other thing that you can do is you can use images off of clip art, with all the move to telehealth and teletherapy. One of the things that we've done is you can make collages via computer. You just have your client go on and look through the clip art, and, that's how you can help them make a collage if you're doing some telehealth. So it can be a little bit different, that way. But there's also, you can have your client collect just a wide array of people, objects, animals, places, landscapes that can be representative of the loss. I often give them the directive that they can use words if they want to, because sometimes I think clients really want to use their words, but they don't know how to do that, maybe with the traditional talk therapy. So let's put it, on a collage. So you can use some words, pictures, whatever works for you. And then also there's some pre-cut, there's collage image resource books available on Amazon. So if you're interested, in looking at some of those, you certainly can. And then once complete, it's really talking about the experience and the meaning as it's related to the loss. So it's not just about the finished product, but I really spent some time talking about the process. What was it like for you to have to go gather some pictures or images or places or words that really relate to the loss that you've had? What was it like for you to have to look at all of that in one space and place it on the collage? Because I think placement's important too. Where are they placing the words, the pictures on the collage? So really spending some time talking about their process. And then also, what does the collage mean to them? What have they created? What does it mean? What can they tell you about the collage? And really allowing them the freedom to pull that out again during your process and add to it if they want to, or maybe even take some things off. Sometimes what I've done with some of my emerging adult clients who've experienced loss is we'll take out that collage and just a big, if they've glued things on there, we'll take a big black marker and they'll just cross through. some of the things that aren't relevant to them anymore, some of the things they feel like they've resolved that they might have put on the collage, in the beginning. So it's a great way for them to just kind of track their progress and to be able to add things and eliminate things, as well when you work with collages. And then this is just an example. This is more of a photo, collage, just allowing somebody to, if they wanted to use pictures to exhibit, how they feel about their grief or loss in different stages. But again, collages look very different, and it's really up to the client, to be able to create that. And I think one of the things that I really like about the collage is it's just a very open-ended prompt. I would like for you to create a collage that represents your loss. Or your process, with the loss, and you just give them that prompt, and then you just let them go so they can make it what they really want to, because it's just a very open-ended prompt and they can conceptualize it however they would like to. Okay, so the grief box is next. And this also is one of my favorites, because this is just a great way for them to be able to explore some of those feelings related to the grieving process. And again, just in a side note, the grief box, if you work with emerging adults who have anger issues or any other issues, you can change this up. It can be an anger box. It can be a grief box. So it's a great, just transferable activity. So it's to assist the client in exploring feelings related to their grieving process. But one of the things that the grief box does is it helps the client identify feelings and discuss when those feelings are most prevalent. The client's able to choose, which I think is really important. I think when we work with clients who have grief and loss issues, or any client, I think it's important to give them a choice. What feelings do they want to process, and how can they process the feelings while the intense feelings can remain in the box? So you can do this activity, again, whatever works best for your client. Some want to actually create a box. So you would use a shoe box and allow them to decorate it with construction paper, however they would like to do that, and then cut a slit in the top for those feelings, to go in the box and what they want to keep in the box. Some clients choose to just want to draw a box on a piece of paper, and they want to do it that way. So I think whatever works best, for your client, I always give clients the choice. I'd say we can do a box, or we can draw it, whatever works best for you. We can use pictures, we can use words, whatever you would like to do. But I think what's so significant about this is the box stays with the therapist. So when the client leaves the session, that grief box and those feelings are with the therapist. And then when the client comes back, we can choose to revisit those feelings or whatever they've put in the box. And it's up to them to really talk about and say, I really want to go into the box today, and I want to talk about the anger that I have. Or I don't really think I can get in the box today. I want to talk about something else. So it's just a great visual, and it really gives the client that control and that power to really think about, when do I want to take something out of the box and process that. Okay, mandalas. So mandalas are just a great way to help clients who have experienced some type of loss in their lives, especially emerging adults, because I find sometimes, because they have so many different things going on developmentally, this is a great way for them just to sit with an activity and to be able to really think about, what they're doing, and to think about that loss that they've experienced. So mandala means circle in Sanskrit. And the structure is, you can do mandalas a couple of ways, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But it's a circle, as we know, mandalas are a circle, and it serves to provide a sense of containment and decreases anxiety for clients. So there's a couple of ways you can do it. Sometimes I will have pre-printed mandalas, and you can get them off. I think I've listed the website on our reference page, but you just go there and you can just download them and print them. And I will ask the client to choose one that they think represents that experience or that grief and that loss. And then I ask them to just color that, based on to create a mandala that signifies their grief and loss. And they pick one and they would do that and they would color it and then we would talk about it. The other way that you can do it is you can just ask them to create their own mandala. So you would just ask them to draw a circle, and then you can prompt them and you can tell them to fill the circle with specific emotions, explore your inner life versus your outer life, or draw inside the circle how you feel today. So you can do it a couple of different ways. I think if you have a client who struggles with just non-directive and they need more structure, then the way to go would be to give them the pre-printed mandalas. But if you have a client who does really well with just those non-directive and just likes to create, then I think just allowing them the time and the freedom to create their own mandala, is really the way to go. And then, so I talked about all that, and I've just given you 2 examples down at the bottom, this is like one that they would maybe choose to pre-fill. And then this is another one that, has been colored with the different colors. And then you would process that with the client. You would ask the client, can you tell me about your mandala? Tell me about how this represents that grief and loss process for you. And then you talk about it. And then again, this is something that can be done throughout the therapeutic process because it will look different. If you do this with a client when they just come in to therapy, when they've just had that loss, or maybe the loss has been a little while, you get them to do the mandala, you can get them to do it during the middle and then at the end, and then you can compare them. And talk about, let's look at these. This is what you did when you first came in 8 months ago. Let's look at the one that you did today and how you've progressed and tell me about that. So again, it's a great visual for them to see some progression and to see how things have changed, for them and have definitely moved for them in the therapeutic process. Okay, so sand tray. Sand tray is just, I can't say enough about sand tray. I think you can use sand tray with any population for any kind of issue. It doesn't just have to pertain to grief or loss, but it is extremely effective for emerging adults who are experiencing some grief and loss issues. But sand tray works universally with families, with couples, with adolescents. It's just such a great intervention, for clients. And it's so powerful. If those of you who have ever used sand tray with a client know how powerful it can be, it's also very powerful for supervision. I use it with my PLPCs, and it's very, very powerful. So in talking about sand tray and working with emerging adults, so one of the things that you need is, of course, you need the sand tray, you need miniatures. I think if you're working with emerging adults who've experienced grief or loss, you would want to get miniatures specific to that. There are several kits you can get via Amazon and some of the specific play therapy suppliers. And I think I've created a link in our references to the one on Amazon that has some specific grief and loss miniatures. So you want to make sure you have those miniatures available, and you want to make sure you have a place where you can display the miniatures so that the client can just go, and when you give them the prompts to create, they can just go and choose the miniatures that they would like to choose to place in the sand. So client is going to select the miniatures that they want to place in the sand tray, and then you want to explore that process with the client. Sometimes you can give them a prompt, and sometimes you don't have to. So a prompt may be, depending on where you are in the process, I would like you to create your world in the sand that conceptualizes or signifies the loss you've experienced. So you can do that. The other prompt you can give them is just say, I would like for you to create your world in the sand, and see what happens, and allow them to do that. Or the other prompt is, I just want you to create whatever you feel like creating in the sand. So you can be very open-ended with it, depending on the client and your relationship with the client and where you are, in the process. But then you would explore the process with the client. So you would look at what miniatures they selected, how they arranged them, is there any meaning behind those miniatures? What story are they trying to tell you based on what they did in the sand? One of the things that I do with clients is I will say, once they've created their world in the sand, I will ask them to take a look and see if they want to add anything or take anything away, before we talk about it, and allow them to do that. And then I will also give them an opportunity, once we've discussed it and once they've shared their story with me, is, okay, if you could recreate this and make it how you wanted it to be, what would it look like? And allow them, to do that. And of course, this is a lot, so you don't do this all in one session. This is done, over a period of time usually. So the research shows that sand tray really increases emotional expression while reducing any distress the client may have that comes from a traumatic event, which a loss is a traumatic event. And it really helps them be able to talk about that experience that they've had once they're able to put that in the sand. So it's really a great way for them to be able to do that. It, allows them to create a visual context, social support. It focuses on the process, and they can own what they've put in the sand. It's theirs. They're creating it. So they can take those miniatures out. They can put those miniatures back. They can decide what miniature signifies, what they want it to signify. So it's really theirs, and they can own it. And then there's 2 links down at the bottom for you. They're both online sand trays. I believe I think they're both free. And if you're doing telehealth, there's also, you can do the sand tray online. So it's just, the client can pull it up. They have miniatures. The client can get the miniatures and drag them over and put them in the sand tray. And then you can definitely talk about that, with your client. But you can do it also via telehealth. Okay, let's see. So what I'm going to talk about next is still on the sand tray. So I want to talk a little bit more about, the reasons why the sand tray is important. So it's, really recognizing those feelings of anxiety. Sometimes grief and loss comes with a lot of feelings of anxiety and feelings of the unknown, and the sand tray can really help with that. You can really see emotions in the sand. When they create that world in the sand, you can see that emotional instability and how they're trying to regulate that. They can create their world in the present. They can create their future world. So it's really important that, again, you can have them. One of the prompts you can give is, I'd like you to create your world in the sand before the loss. I'd like you to create your world in the sand after the loss, and have them, and you can compare them and contrast them. And then, what world, how can you bring those worlds together? Let's put them together in one sand tray and see what that looks like. And again, it's just a great visual for the client to help them process some of those emotions. And then I've given you the virtual sand tray. That's the free sand tray online, the grief sand tray miniatures, where you can get those if you're interested, in getting some miniatures that are specific to grief and loss. And then also there's a link to an article that talks about using sand tray with emerging adults. Okay, so I want to talk about music. I know we're at 10:54, so let me just talk quickly about music, and then we'll see if I'll speed it up because I want to get to the suitcase activity, and then I'll see if we have questions. So music is an excellent intervention. It's an extremely powerful medium for accessing both emotions and memories. I think it's important when you work with emerging adults to use music, because a lot of them, music is very important. I think having them create a grief playlist would be helpful. So I'd instruct the client to identify songs that are particularly meaningful to them. And possibilities, you can give them prompts. You can say, my special person's favorite song, a song that reminds you of your loved one, a song that brings you comfort, anything that's specific to the loss that they've experienced. And so you can ask them to create that playlist, and then they can share that with you, and you can talk about it, during your session. A song from our relationship, a song that lets my anger out, a song that helps me cry when I'm having trouble crying, a song that I've changed my mind about after the loss, and a song for my future. And then you have them come bring those to session. May be beneficial to listen to more than one at a time, and then process with the client the memories and the emotions that arise. Again, you can do this over a course of sessions. You know, this may be a lot to do in just one session. You're really going to have to gauge how that works, you know, with your client and where your client is. All right, well, I'm going to stop. I think eco mapping, suitcase activity. Yeah, we weren't able to get to those, but I want to leave time for questions, and I think we're at 10:56. So what I would ask is we'll take time for questions, and then if y'all want to look over, I think we just had the suitcase activity and eco mapping were it. If y'all just want to look over those, and if you have questions about those, you can email me directly, and I would be happy, you know, to answer any of those questions that you might have about those two activities that we didn't get to.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fazios Griffith and Dr. Williams. I'm sorry that we run out of time. I know you have a lot more to share with us. Does anyone have a quick question? We do need to wrap up here in a few minutes, but if you have a question for our presenters, please put it in the prompt and give them your appreciation and applause.
And I'll just say too, that I wanted to thank Joey for putting a lot of links in the chat. And so if you want to go in, and you should be able to highlight the whole chat and copy it. And then you have the link to the presentation, the links that Joey put in. I believe that there was a reference, Cody shared a reference, and Kristen also had an activity that she suggested. So you can get all of that by just highlighting it.
Oh, yes. And also I have a question from Callaway. Does this apply to students? I believe it does. You wouldn't get continuing education credit, but I think you can receive a participation certificate. Am I right, Chris?
All certificates are NBCC clock hour certificates. So it's not going to hurt you to have one. You can use that as showing participation, but you can't use it towards, you cannot use it towards your certification because you're not certified yet.
Hey, Chris, I'll pop in. I spoke to me and Colleen were going back and forth. For students, if you will please go ahead and do that. And do the little quiz and get your certificate. You'll be able to upload that to get your participation points.
And the question about if it's not working, you can contact Office of CE at the Chicago School .edu. In order for it to work, you do need to be logged into the website. If you are not logged into the website, it will not work. So please make sure the directions are in the email. So please make sure you are logged into the website.
And that login's there at the top. It's a little tricky to find, but yeah. And then on your students, make sure that you check your other box if you use the focused on the other. I found some of mine over there. So that might help. That may be helpful for later too, Chris. Kind of realize that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dixon. Thank you once again to everyone. I have some questions about how to get my 20-year-old who's states away in college into some grief counseling. So that would be a question for me, but we'll save it for another time. Again, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.